life is for us to control our consciousness. I don't quite mean that, but yeah, to control our consciousness, and therefore say, well, make the world a better place. Because if enough of us can have the same kind of conscious activity and rise above, because it fits in with your talk as well, which is assuming that if you commit certain things, if we commit to one, both things are true, that both kind of things are true, and we just need to expand our minds, therefore expand our consciousness. And if we do that, then we can affect, we'll make a better world, can't we?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, there's a number of ways of putting that, but to understand that there's a close connection between what we call reality and our states of mind, yes.
Yeah.
And at the moment we're doing all sorts of things. We have a crisis, in a sense, which arises because we don't see that.
And because we've got
we don't see that we are creating the
focuses on the negative, and this is going on, we don't understand it. Whereas actually, just open minds, genetically and directed in a better direction.
Yeah, maybe just add that, to me, that journey from darkness or uncoherence to light or coherence is something that underpins everything, both the indigenous culture and also this talk on light. And so I'd say that in a way that is our task, is to find coherence. And that's becoming a very concentrated question, given the fragmentation of this age.
The state we're in at the moment, compared to the indigenous tribes who are actually still practicing and understanding, if you like, a better life. It would seem.
Yes, I'm very interested in how you can use quantum theory for practical real-life initiatives. So I'm just thinking that many natural scientists would say that quantum theory is only applicable in the microscopic, and Newtonian physics in the macroscopic, and is trying to keep these two separate. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think there's a whole, the parapsychology is one indication that the way reality, the way we can interact with reality is not limited by Newtonian assumptions. And people have all kinds of mystical experiences, or whatever you might call them, or they have sometimes, the whole use of LSD and this kind of thing is becoming more popular again. There are states and experiences we can have which are more in keeping with the quantum picture of the world than they are with the Newtonian picture. And so the idea that maybe the reason we see reality in a Newtonian sense is because we believe that's how reality is. If our beliefs about the nature of reality shifted, the reality we see would start shifting. This is a fairly some people would have trouble with that idea, but that's the implication. In terms of what I do in thinking about the future, if it is true, it's said in things like The Secret and that kind of thing, or The Course in Miracles, that claim that we create our own future through what we focus on mentally. Well, that seems to be coming through in these quantum experiments. So, talking about the state of the world, if we are afraid that there's going to be a catastrophe, and we are focused entirely on the potential catastrophe of global warming, then maybe we're actually causing that to come about. It would appear that skillful thinking about the future involves focusing on, the futures we aspire to, the futures we wish would occur.
Yeah, also I'd say that, so when Newton claimed that red, green and blue were the foundation of light, if you allow Goethe's theories to be equally true, Goethe's way of approach, then you have to say that even though Newton was right, that red, green and blue are one foundation of light, they're not the only one. And you have to give up this idea that there's a single reality, objective reality underpinning us. And so that causes us to say that there are many possible ways of seeing the world. And then that requires us to ask, well, where does the unity of the world come from, if it's not simply a material unity? And then we have to say it comes from our own behaviour, our own experience with the world. And so it's an enormous shift that's kind of implicit, where we're not simply living a single reality, a material reality, but our experience is giving us the question of, do we want to live unity? Do we want to live a coherence? And how can we choose to make that come about?
Do you think this paradigm shift could create a more positive or a better reality or a better future? Or it will just create a transition and change it? Do you think it will necessarily imply a more positive outcome than the current state?
I don't think it's necessarily going to do that. I mean, there's always, in a sense, hazard. But I think the potential exists more now for some kind of transformative future. But I think what we think of as technology today could be on a kind of convergent path with what we think of as spiritual. And I think there will be a number of, I think there's already signs that technologies that are somehow both spiritual and technological are going to appear, where they're not as sort of solid, if you like, as we think of technology at the moment. So, of course, that gives us more power, and there's a responsibility. So I think that the rise of technology needs to be matched by a rise of spiritual understanding or spiritual development, otherwise the whole thing's out of kilter. And I think that's what's happening. And it may be that the very advanced technologies sort of won't be released, if you use that way of thinking, until we've reached a sufficient level of spiritual advancement.
I find it really ironic that a culture that's so supposedly rationalist and wants to look at cause and effect could be causing so much damage to our own psyches and to the world around us. I wondered if you thought there were any particular scientific narratives or ideas that we hold in culture that we should start to try and move away from, which might maybe contributing to this destruction.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that if you look at the indigenous culture, like in Colombia, then it's, as people were saying, it's still very coherent. And we've gone into this age of allowing technology, of allowing thought to come up with new inventions. And it's taken us into a million different places. There are so many specialities, so many places we can go that distract us. And it's a completely new challenge we have now of how do we return to unity? How do we redeem this fragmented world? And it's a completely new question that hasn't been asked before. Indigenous cultures didn't ask that question. And I would say that like Newton, he had a rival mathematically who developed calculus at the same time called Leibniz, whose ideas were much more holistic. And Newton kind of drove Leibniz out of the scientific arena by saying his views had to do with God, occultism, and other things not to be considered in philosophy. And so he set up science as if it was something mechanical and exact. And so we have to, as Hardin was saying, reintegrate the technological and the experiential, or the spiritual, and allow that reality is not so simple, that it's simply a material universe, and that it requires skill and practice and discipline to live in a way that's in harmony with the universe.
I think I've heard you talk about that before in relation to this, what you call the thought paradigm and the heart paradigm.
Yeah.
Is that?
That's right, yeah. So
and how would they relate, and how would they relate to a more sustainable and more just world?
yeah, so often when we're in the West, we're just living in a thought kind of matrix, where we're bombarded with information. We try to construct arguments on an intellectual basis, and we even though thought is good in being able to take things out of their context and to find the causes of things, and to be able to change the causes into applicable technologies that substitute for how the world works. But like when I go to Colombia and you meet a totally different culture, then that culture is understanding its wisdom from the heart. It's not looking to fragment the world. It's saying that the heart has a direct connection to understand that story of darkness and light. And that, like when we look at the picture of the cathedral and the people in the street, we need the heart to understand that picture of the world for us. And so this integration of a story that is not intellectually interpreted, but is directly lived to make sense of the world, I think is something that's kind of arising newly as our intellectual and rational systems start to fall apart.
It's interesting in relation to what you're talking about, Hardin, as well. There's a kind of heart-to-heart connection in the relation of the observer to what you, to the matter, the reality of the matter, and this idea as well of how you can have a connection with somebody that feels deeper or beyond that of verbal or mental. It can be something they say is the heart-to-heart connection. And also when you read about animal trackers who are very skilled, like I think of the San in Namibia, and they talk, when they go tracking, they talk about entering into the consciousness of the animal that they're tracking. And it seems that there is a sense of something that's much deeper that is being experienced by people all over, particularly in older cultures as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite hard for us to talk about these things because it's on the sort of frontier of our understanding. But I mean, there's so many different ways of trying to explain that. But because we have so focused on the idea that we occupy a world made of material stuff, and we see nature as a resource for us, it's just stuff for us to use, as opposed to seeing it as life, and we're also part of that life. And we think of human beings in terms of being something material as well. Whereas if you think more of, say, the dream experience is more like some of this, this experience of, say, a tracker projecting themselves into the consciousness of the animal is more like the kinds of transitions that occur in dreams, for example, where there isn't a single fixed reality, but there's something. I mean, if you try and imagine, for example, what it's like, what experience, psychological or phenomenological experience would be like if in a realm which was not structured in terms of time and space. That's very challenging for us, but it appears that space-time itself unfolds from the quantum field. I mean, there are a number of different theories about this, but space and time are not the container in which everything is, but they are a way of presenting the world. So you might have, in dreams, for example, you sort of think of something and you suddenly jump to somewhere else. You don't have to travel to go somewhere else. It's some sort of, it's more like an associational space. An idea comes up and when you're thinking, you think of something or experience something, suddenly it reminds you of all the cases like that. Or the dream reality is structured more like that. But maybe reality is structured more like that, but we're in a zone which is structured according to this notion of time and space.
So would you say quantum theory supports an idea of interspecies communication or inter-being communication or not?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say, because I've discovered I have to be really careful in saying it's not that quantum theory says that, because quantum theory actually says very little. It's mathematics. But as soon as you think about what it says that reality has all these strange properties, then immediately you think, well, that must mean that reality in general has those properties. So if the evidence about the nature of consciousness would suggest that interspecies or person to person, there's, if you like, a great part of what's going on is going to be telepathic. We have debates about Brexit, to mention that, since you mentioned it. but then at some unconscious level, there's a big telepathic debate about Brexit going on, which we're not even conscious of. Maybe we are in our dreams or something. So I mean, there's no end to.
What do you mean telepathic debate?
Well, if we're all in contact at a telepathic level, because consciousness is interconnected, then at some level, I mean, this has a model of consciousness where it's like an iceberg. The bit we're aware of, the biological consciousness, is the little bit above the water. But all the rest of our self, our deep self, is, at another level of consciousness.
Do you think meditation could help to access more consciousness?
Well, I think that not necessarily always and all the time, but that meditation is opening up more consciousness, if you like, or can, or could do, So, but I think in terms of, one analogy I have, if you think about modern medicine, treats the body as a physical thing to be repaired by mechanical intervention, surgery. But if the body is a kind of hologram of the self, if it's the biological hologram of the self, then when you think about what a holographic image is like, you wouldn't try and change it by surgery. You'd try and change it by the underlying field that was generating the holographic image. And I think, so that gives us a hint as to what medicine is more likely to be like in the future.
What happens to the individual within quantum theory and what it might possibly say about it, and what does it mean to say that we're relational from that perspective?
Well, again, I don't want to place too much of a burden on quantum theory. Quantum theory tells us something about our most fine-grained knowledge of the nature of reality, and it's telling us that our ordinary picture isn't quite right. So the individual, in psychology, in consciousness, there's the phenomenon of dissociation, and this occurs in various traumatic states and so on. So if consciousness in ordinary psychology can dissociate, maybe the cosmic consciousness can dissociate into what appear to be individuals in order to experience all the diversity that's been created within consciousness. And Watts' phrase, God playing hide and seek with himself. So this is the totality experiencing itself as little fragments.
It's interesting as well to think that Newton became very popular at a time when you said that apart from Newton it was very much ideas of the occult and superstition. And then his ideas were seized, and now they're very much kind of status quo. And it's in a way it's become as powerful as the church was before some new science. And do you think that is detrimental? And do you think it's going to be changing as our understanding of science opens up? And perhaps Hardin, you have something to add because it relates to how you're working in the corporate sphere and if you're seeing a change as well.
The background to Newton was that there'd been a very enlightened era in the 12th to 15th century, which ended with the Inquisition, and Protestantism came in, and so it became very much that the freedom for different views, the diversity and plurality, was changed into one view was right, and that was the kind of bedrock in which science started saying that it had the one story about the world, and that was the kind of pressure on Newton to say that his theory of colour was the theory of colour. It was not simply one way that colour presented itself. And so the way science took hold in eclipsing any other kind of order, so it completely eradicated this idea that there's a natural order belonging to our soul, belonging to the nature of reality that is not material. And that was what Goethe was trying to get back to. But you see increasingly in the history of science that science has taken a stand against that other type of order. That it's fine we have our technologies, but it's denied that order of the soul as incompatible with the material objective universe. And so to me, if you look at the debate now about Newton and Goethe, it actually completely undermines the idea that there is only one view of the world, there's only one order, which is materialism. And that if that debate was to properly happen, and that's one of my ideas, that we should revisit this Newton-Leibniz debate, where Leibniz was thrown out of science, and to look with current evidence of quantum theory and Goethe and colour about can these two orders coexist with each other. I think if science was to really look at and question its own assumptions at the moment, it would have to relinquish that claim that only the materialism is the only order which gives sense and coherence to the world. So it's like that science is in a psychological state where it only believes its own mind. It can only see what's in the light. It can't see the darkness. It can't see the nothing. It can't see the zero. And so it can only see the world man creates, the world man constructs. It can't see the world in which man is as a child, as somebody who has to create in the world in order to find his own existence.
Except that science, is changing, and therefore
Yeah.
it would say, so it's us and our view of it and how we use it, in that it is actually proving now that prayer exists. So it that wiped it out in Newton's day and said there's going to be only one way and one way is right, and therefore all the religious ones went under the radar, shall we say, and made it so it's only one of them. So we've just got only science, we've got to only do the body and the physics of it, and that's closed our minds off to everything, whereas actually there's a whole other set of circumstances going on. The universe itself is proving, science is proving that prayer works, consciousness is becoming a really, we can show that this has an effect, and the opposite thing is happening of its own accord. So if we read science slightly differently, then we've got to change our minds.
But at the same time, to go to the question you asked me, science is incredibly, the science of establishment is incredibly resistant to change.
It's a shame,
Why?
for God's sake.
Well, this is one of the questions. I've been involved in a project that the Scientific and Medical Network have been running, which we call the Galileo Project, which was trying to look at the assumptions in science and why they were holding science back at this point. But exactly what it is. I mean, some people say that there's almost an active program to stop these ideas coming forward. I think that gets you into conspiracy theory as opposed to just sort of mental inertia. But certainly, I think people are afraid for all sorts of reasons. If you've built your career as an academic scientist over a long period of time, and suddenly a lot of the precepts you've been using are suddenly swept away, then obviously that's not very comfortable. Your authority then suffers, so I mean there are all sorts of sort of the sociology of science has got something to do with this. But I don't think anybody can quite put a finger on exactly what it is. It's a whole complex of factors that are creating this resistance.
But it's also a linear understanding of science. The mainstream understanding is very linear, and so is our model of economic, social growth. It's also very linear, this idea of permanent growth. So maybe it kind of destabilizes.
Well, linear in the sense of sort of an acceleration or something, yes, more and more. We've got a bit, more would be better. I don't know, I'm not sure quite how true it is that the science is entirely linear at this point, because we get mathematical meaning of those terms, but we have chaos theory, complexity theory and so on, and we can model systems on computers, so actually multiple variables can be handled simultaneously. So, one has to have shades of sort of meaning in this, but certainly the assumption that we can just keep using stuff and there's no problem, that, and of course, fear and greed are big factors in all this as well, so it comes down to rather basic emotions, so it's quite complicated.
I think we like to cling to the idea of fixed laws and fixed ideas, and that's what makes us feel safe. Like on an emotional level, as soon as there's change, we will kind of start to worry and stop feeling safe anymore. But I think that's what I like about what's been discussed today, is this idea of adaptability and change and not always knowing. And if we could integrate that more into our own lives, we could be a little less fearful and be able to actually see what's going on and adapt to it and change rather than think that it's going to shake the ground of our being.
you know, I mean, if you expand the worldview, then you have to expand in some way to go along with that. You know? If you try and stay with your, you know, where you were, then and the worldview looks like it's opening up, then you're going to feel a bit stranded. You know? So there's a kind of challenge to personal change, which.
Yeah, and also just to reiterate that main point, that Newton's order is based on matter. I mean, right through his whole work of motion and which led to cars and planes. And Goethe's is based on surrender. There's an order that you're not creating something brick by brick like building a house, but you're creating an order by surrendering to something whole and thereby giving it contour and relief holistically. And so I think we've sort of got caught in this idea, like Newton, that that everything is in the light, everything is matter, everything has to be built and constructed. And this complementary perspective has sort of got, we're blinded to seeing it almost by
surrendering, do you mean to surrender you can become an expression of what it is you're surrendering to rather than having to create
exactly,
it
yeah.
and make something of
Yeah,
yourself?
exactly, yeah.
Could you repeat that, please? Please, would you repeat what you understood the surrender to mean?
I think I said that instead, that by surrendering, you're able to become an expression of the thing which you're experiencing, whereas if you do it the other way around, you're trying to recreate what it is you think you're experiencing, and
Impose it.
And I suppose there's this link to consciousness, that somehow these wholes exist already in consciousness at some level, or the consciousness at some level is a unity, this mystery of the unity and the diversity, that it all has a common identity in the unity, but in order to, as it were, make life interesting, it's diversified into all these things, but they're all still linked under the surface. And so the whole is an expression, or recognition of the whole is a recognition of this underlying unity,
Yeah.
which materialism can't really find.
No, and in holistic science, it's always that both are true at the same time. So there is that diversity, there is that fragmentation and identity in parts, but there's always that, at the same time, there's that opening to the whole, the surrender, to allow something new in. And if we were to grasp that, then our technology would not be made redundant, but it would serve the whole rather than dominate it or eclipse it.
Question at the back?
You talked about like light and dark and chaos and order and all that kind of stuff, and then also talked about the importance of integration between the two. And I feel like personally in life I'm kind of drawn into like that sort of spiritually realm that doesn't seem to make sense in a quantum way, but then also I'm like on the tube charging my phone and I don't know how to integrate the two, and I wondered if you practice anything yourself that seems to make sense between the two things, if you kind of bridge what you have to exist in as a person that lives in a quantum and Newtonian world at the same time to make sense of your stuff of life.
Good question.
Well, I mean, I have experienced that what some aspect of what I'm thinking at some level changes what happens. But it may not, it may be at a somewhat deeper level than just sort of superficial thinking. It's almost like there's a permission that you give from some level as to whether this thing will happen or not. So, and I'm aware that I can switch on and off certain things according to whether sometimes I get fed up with things, and as soon as I get fed up with a particular thing, then particularly I actually want that result to be going on, and it stops, and I realise that okay, well, I'm going to have to actually like that thing for it to go on. So it sounds. I mean, this kind of talk from a modernist perspective is quite weird, But I know this is true in my own experience, and so part of what we need to do is to revalidate our own subjective experience. And that needs qualifying too, because there's all kinds of subjective experience. You know, there are people that murder people and say, "Oh, the voices in my head told me to do it," so we have to be a little discriminating. You know. But certainly opening up much more to the fact that reality is responding to us. Reality, now whether you get a bit solipsistic if you start thinking that you make reality. I'm not saying that, but certainly we are in an interaction with the nature of reality, which has got nothing to do with Newtonian force. It's to do with this thought field. Maybe the quantum wave function, it seems to be behaving like a thought field. I'm not sure that I want to say it is the sort of the mental field, but it certainly seems to be influenced by it. And there's certainly some kind of underlying field, well that's the title of that Lynn McTaggart book, the idea that there is this underlying field which is actually shaping reality, but we also participate in that shaping. So we're not completely responsible for the whole of it, but we play a part in it.
It's empowering.
Well, if you look at it in that way, yeah. So, but it's the participation in the field which is important.
A beauty when you do seem to find an integration, whether it's maybe in a meditative state or like looking at art where you say you see colour and colours from the darkness and the light at the same time, and you can kind of experience maybe two things at once. But like I don't know what other things there are that make you feel that things make sense.
Maybe I'd say that I think many people feel at the moment that even though it seems everything is fragmented and systems are not operating as they were, there's a huge sense of coming into new meaning of many people, and that sense that as a collective, as a civilization, or as a culture, or as a generation, we can find a meaning, we can find significance in life, and we can find what is the unity or the identity that holds us together. And of course, we glimpse that. You go to Columbia, you glimpse one aspect of it. You come here, you glimpse another aspect of it. But to me, that sense that coherence is taking on a new form, which nobody quite knows what it is, but that we feel it inside, and that we're directing our lives towards it. And so to me, that's like why I've started Global Synapses. How do you get synapses to connect together into a thought or into an insight when you don't quite know what you're doing as an individual, why you're making the choices you are? But there seems to be some sense in which, alongside the jobs and being on the tube, there is a greater sense to life that's expressing itself at the moment.
Yes, you both or all may be aware of, or familiar with the work of a British psychiatrist, Ian McGilchrist, and his studies of the brain, which indicate that the two hemispheres of the brain, which are differently shaped and somewhat asymmetrical and have two distinct, although cooperative functions. And he's spent decades studying the brain such that he has come to, and he's a psychiatrist, so he's also studied people and their states of mind in the culture in the last 4 decades. But his conclusion is that our brains, our minds are much more capable of consciousness than we are using them, which I think even ages ago, science or scientists were thinking that physically the brain was, they couldn't imagine what all the parts of the brain were doing. But he says that the right hemisphere, which is the sort of greater part of the brain that looks at the whole, the sort of the more holistic view of the world, and then the left hemisphere looks at the details, and that over the last millennia, perhaps, or since the Enlightenment, certainly, and as our education and our way of ordering and understanding the world has become more materialistic, then there's been an over assumption that this way of looking at the world is correct, and by focusing so much on that part of our way of operating and being conscious, we've actually shut down the greater part of our consciousness. And he would say that the two parts of the brain, the bigger picture and the smaller details, really work best when they work together, and there is a kind of cyclical motion to our greater understanding, which I think we've all been sort of suggesting or encountering in this discussion and in our own studies. It's interesting even trying to talk about how to talk about it, because language really ends up, I think, sort of condensing things in such a way that it does argue for myth or magical thinking, because there are ways in which the beauty of quantum theory is that it says very little, but it implies very much. And when you start to even asking questions, well, will this consciousness then allow this outcome or this outcome? And yes, it may or it may not, but I think what we're grappling with now, the way we are encountering the world, unlike perhaps the Colombian or the more indigenous cultures, who don't feel that they need to understand every moving part of the world, but look at it holistically and heart-centered, which is interesting because energy medicine is also looking at the energy fields of the body and the holistic aspect of the human being, with the primary brain, as it were, being the heart, which is the one that encounters the universe and makes sense of it first. So I think I wonder if even in our scientific universe, where we're trying desperately to find and grasp the answer, that we're sort of in some ways missing, or maybe coming to a point where the point is not so much to grasp, but to keep into this cycle of darkness and light and unconsciousness and revelation. And really that reality is going to be one thing to one culture and one time or one person, which doesn't discount reality or doesn't even make it so relativist to be without meaning, but rather to make every moment and aspect of it so completely full of meaning that it transcends and defies mere explanation, but invites fullest experience.
I mean, I would just expand that perspective a little, because the notion that there is specialization of the two sides of the brain is a very powerful idea. It's certainly a powerful critique of the Western style culture that we've created, being all left brain. But this notion of spirituality is kind of being bandied around, and the question arises what exactly that means. But my sort of sense of it is that ourselves, we are more than just the physical body, the biological body, the brain and the kind of consciousness that it supports. But there's a kind of deeper dimension of that, in which much wider conscious experience is possible, but there seems to be some kind of narrowing or focusing from the biological point of view, which I suppose you could argue is necessary for survival, etc. It's also necessary for specialized experience, but that for some reason the awareness of this larger aspect is opening up at the present. Now we have all sorts of speculative thoughts as to what that suggests for the future, but it does seem to be happening. There's an opening up, and I think what is there to be revealed is that the inner structure, the structure of the soul, the inner self, whatever you're going to call it, all the old words have sort of atrophied, will be as much structure and as much detail as science has shown us that there is in the outer world. And that the part of what's going to happen in the future is that the contact or awareness between the inner self and the outer self will become much greater. It's a bit like Gurdjieff's idea of self-remembering, that the waking up of the inner self, which has been dormant in us, wakes up and in a sense begins to interact with the biological self. So there's a fusion of inner and outer, and this is part of this coming spirituality, and that is arising. So goes along with that is the idea of spiritual growth, that this inner aspect of the self itself can develop. Now in the esoteric tradition, of course, descriptions of the etheric body and the astral body and all this kind of thing. There's a whole typology of levels and so forth, and it's the actual experiential encounter with that, not only on an individual basis, but it seems as if this is now beginning to happen culturally. So the whole culture is opening up, or a big chunk of it. So it's because I slightly worry about the pure kind of this biological determinism that we are made by our brains. I'm sure it's not what we're trying to say, no.
Yes.
But I just wanted to sort of widen the frame of reference a little. So the kind of consciousness that can be supported in the biological brain may become much broader, because we certainly in a technological society where the biological body can be quite safe. I mean, things like the Monroe Institute have been pioneering some of these directions. So I think we'll see more of that.
Oh, sorry.
No?
No, I was just going to
Right,
ask a question.
yeah.
I just had a question, because some of the things that you're describing as new things are actually very old things in terms of ancient cultures or the Eastern tradition and so on. Energy medicine, chakras, consciousness linked. But do you think that in Western culture, science is the doorway through? Because in some way it's been touched on by other people as well, because you're still trying to understand something with your head, where the head isn't the easiest or most convenient place sometimes to go to, because it's still trying to apply certain things that try and make it make sense. Whereas the other traditions will have ways where you almost go around your mind, where you work with your mind in consciousness with something different to try and open up to that experience. So I'm just wondering whether if science can't explain it in one thing, whether science trying to explain it is the space, what it will add basically.
I think it does add something. I don't know if you've read the work of Richard Tarnas, for example, Cosmos and Psyche, but the idea that there have been these long psychic periods of development in looking back over the last several hundred years, and the period since the period that Philip was describing, since the onset of the scientific revolution, I'm sort of paraphrasing Richard Tarnas' idea, probably not very accurately, but that there's this sharpening of the focus of the outward gaze on the physical world, sharpening up, because you think we have nanotechnology now. We've not only sharpened our attention on the world, but we've made our manipulation of the physical world more and more and more precise. It's an amazing thing we've done, the sort of fine-pointedness that we've achieved outwardly. And I think something has been crafted through that. There's an outer mind which is so sharp and precise it didn't exist before. And that, if that's now reintegrated with this inner aspect, then something's been added. So I don't see science as being somehow the wrong thing to have done, something like that, because in any case much bigger forces are at work than just what we think about these things. And so something has been crafted through this long arc of the scientific revolution. But now is the time when it's going to re-immerse in the stuff that was known to indigenous cultures, and that fusion can occur. But the modern scientific piece brings something new to bear. We don't quite yet know fully what that can be, but there's something that's been created, and it's all experiment. It's all creativity, but it's creativity on long time frames, hundreds of years, thousands of years. Which, of course, since everything's timeless at another level, is nothing.
One last question.
Just curious, I completely agree about how there's going to be sort of convergence back with sort of spiritual tradition with technology, and technology is not the enemy, nor is science. It's just about sort of reintegrating our frame of reference and what we are discovering through those modes that we would never have had construct to look at sort of indigenous ideas before. But you mentioned when you were talking about it in your talk about spiritual technologies. I was just curious if you might elaborate on anywhere on the frontier of that type of stuff in your futurist wanderings?
Well, because if you're thinking about the future, one way of seeing hints of the future is to be open to all sorts of things that are happening, weird things on the fringe, and not necessarily deciding for yourself whether you think they're true or not, but just see what they are. What are the ideas? What are people talking about? What are people saying exists? So there are some people who say there's over-unity energy, for example. Well, if we don't try and make a decision about that, we say, oh, well, that's interesting idea. You see the same idea occurring. So people or the idea of being able to create energy, some gadget, you put a little bit of electricity in and more electricity comes out. Well, physics would say that's rubbish, that's impossible, but there are a number of people claiming that is true. Well, without pronouncing on that, I just observe that that's part of our culture, people talking about that. Similarly, there are people in the culture, particularly in the area of health technologies, where it's sort of energy medicine meets technology. And I think that's a hint of this kind of thing. So there are hints that genetics can be altered by...
What do you mean? Do you mean like as in using energy, just modes of energy healing, but within a more mainstream...
Well, maybe thought
medical
energy and technological manipulation of energy come together. Maybe they interact. Maybe the technology... Okay, stuff in the culture. There's all this stuff about UFOs, right? All this Area 52, these UFOs that are supposed to have been found. I'm keeping nicely balanced here as a skeptic and the convert. But one of the things that is said about those is that they are telepathic interfaces in these UFOs that have been captured. And we see the same thing. There was a science fiction movie where the world is rescued by... I've forgotten the name of the movie now. They get into they kind of do a James Bond thing and they figure out how to fly it. They bump into a few things on the way out of the space station, but they get the hang of it. Some of you have probably seen that movie. So that idea of technology, which is telepathic technology, and that apparently the interface is there's a sort of palm print on the dashboard, as it were. And supposedly you place your hands on that, and now you're in telepathic contact with the machine, with the computer running the machine. Well, that sort of thing. I mean, you can take it as fiction, or however you want to take it. But that notion, because it's the idea of something like that, which is in the culture. It's either in the fiction or it's in people. Maybe it's really happened.
I think we've definitely seen a few technologies that a few years ago you might have thought was magical.
I think there'll be
glass bricks in our pockets, and we forget that that's technology that you one day would have thought was
becoming
magic.
more and more magical. There's that old Arthur C. Clarke thing, insufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But that could go very deep.
And maybe I'd add that to me that if we stop seeing science as something exact, where you have all these specializations that are tuning in onto more meaningless areas of life and matter, and instead look again for that huge canvas, that holistic canvas of
we come up with the idea of consilience,
of
unity of knowledge.
That how can we interpret together a world that's meaningful, and that is equally an aspect of this journey of coherence or into light, than trying to reduce the world to things we completely understand. And so I think that would give us a better appreciation of the bigger picture of where we are and what we need to do. And so for me, events like these are really helpful in saying, well, why do we call science simply those narrow areas? Surely we need to balance that with opening out, to breathe. Where are we? What is the meaning of quantum theory that we've been holding so close for 100 years? Or what is Goethe's vision that has been negated by mainstream theory, theoretical consensus? So in that I see that something really creative can happen. That should be right at the root of our culture, because we are a scientific culture, and yet we're in a terrible mess, so we need that bigger picture to know where we are.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
thank you. I think that's a really inspiring note to end on.